So, welcome everyone to the first episode of Software is a Team Sport. This is a mini-series podcast about working on teams as a manager, even as a core contributor. Just, how can we work on teams better? What are some fun stories and things we can learn about and talk about and, hopefully understand how to work on teams better. So, my first guest today is Corbin Crutchley. He has worked on a bunch of really cool open source stuff. He's currently at Descript as a staff software engineer, I believe.
Yep.
Awesome. And he's got a pretty crazy, long history as a software dev that I was just looking through right before this call. So he can tell us a little bit more about that. So Corbin, tell us about a little bit of your history, some of the stuff you're working on now.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, so first of all, thank you for having me. Always appreciate it. Love being able to sit down and have a chat. So I've been a software engineer for 10 years now. Well, it'll be 10 years in next month. And I'd done some open source stuff before then, but it gets muddy when you start counting hobbyist stuff. So I just count the professional years. So I started as a system administrator for a school, but they had me doing a lot of programming work to kind of fill in gaps for software they couldn't afford, ironically. So, I was just building scripts and automation tools and whatever in Python to kind of fill that gap. And then because of my open source work, I got brought on to a company called Linked, which built construction software. After about 3 years at the company, I ended up leading the front end, which was kind of interesting because, it was like a 3-person startup. So it was like someone had to own the front end, and it was going to be the guy that liked working on it, I guess.
Yep.
And then after that, I got my big break at Hilton. Me and 2 or 3 other people and a couple side teams built the search page for Hilton from scratch, which was a crazy experience because I went from a 3-person startup to building software that millions of people were using every month, which was kind of incredible. And then from there, I went from a company called Coopervision, did a stint as a DevRel at CoderPad, and then migrated to lead a team at my last company, a team of 4. I believe it was 4 made. No, it was 4. Sorry.
Nice. No worries.
And then that was really cool because I was in charge of the whole front end stack. And then my boss was in charge of the whole back end. So it was a cool dynamic there where even though he was above me in a level, we were very respectful towards each other's stack and understanding that no, we have expertise in this domain.
Yeah.
And then finally I've moved back into an IC role at Descript as a staff engineer.
Awesome. Yeah, that is quite a history right there. What is something you've kind of noticed, working between smaller teams and larger teams? What makes a successful small team, I guess, is one of the first steps.
Ooh, that's a good one. I feel like so many people focus on the big teams because it's there's so many more people to manage. It's so much more complex. But in reality, I think it's the opposite. I think it's the smaller teams that are harder to manage because you have to have higher throughput for because you are a smaller team, you have to be a little bit more scrappy with how you approach problems, right? Mm-hmm. You can't sit there and decide to refactor things in a substantial way unless you can really, really justify why you're doing that refactor work, right?
Sure.
But vice versa, you can sit there and you can make more structured arguments for why you want your code to be a certain way and approach them that way. And then, of course, there's the interpersonal level, right? As a smaller team, you're going to be tighter knit. You're going to be running into each other's quarters more often. So it's important to be able to have a team that understands each other, wants to work with each other, and kind of plays well.
Right. Yeah. On a smaller team, you almost have to wear more hats. So there's less of someone else you can rely on to be that subject matter expert. Surprise, you're the new subject matter expert sometimes, right?
And it's funny because I know a lot of smaller startups really try to save money by avoiding hiring someone very senior. And I think that this can be a real challenge when you do have to wear that many hats. I think that one of the things that I've gotten really good at as I've grown into a more senior position is that I have ended up getting really good at solving problems that literally no one else on earth has, right? Sure. You run into that one edge case that's not on GitHub, it's not on Stack Overflow, it's not anywhere, and you just have to figure it out.
Yep.
And I think that in small startups, that skill is super, super valuable because it means that it's the difference between shipping and not shipping. And on a smaller team, you just have to ship.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. So on some of these teams, were like you ever like the new person?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you were like joining as like a new person, what were like some of the things that were like annoying about like the onboarding process? Like what could be better? What would you focus on like if you're starting a team from scratch?
So I think that even just having like one of the big ones for me is terminology. I'm so bad at terminology in general in tech, but especially when you join a company, they're like the SRP and the API and the DNS, like those are common industry terms,
Sure.
but like you start getting into more specific stuff to the company. Like I remember we had like the AA and the AVA and the ADA and the what, like I'm like, what are these terms? Like seriously.
Yeah.
Like and they're throwing them around in meetings like they're running out of style, you know?
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe like just having a terminology doc right there in your core repo or knowledge base or whatever. Like,
well, and that's the other thing. Having a centralized place to go look up information is so valuable. It doesn't matter whether it's Notion, whether it's a markdown file, whatever it is. Having one place where you can go reference for multiple different things is super, super important.
Right. Yeah. I've worked at a company that had like a really good knowledge base, and I've worked at others where it's just like, yeah, it's in a markdown in some repo somewhere. We don't know where.
Yeah, yeah.
It just depends.
And being able to update it is really key as well. Because I know that a lot of companies have this knowledge base and then no one touches it. Right? It's like that like age-old like documentation that never gets updated in the code because no one bothers. You have to make it a priority. You have to assign tickets in a sprint to make it so that you go update those docs and like prioritize that for potential newcomers that come in.
Yep. Yeah, I've been like kind of like on the fence about AI, but I found a really good use case lately where I'll take like an entire back-end endpoint, throw it into Claude, and have it create a mermaid diagram for me.
Oh, yeah.
And I would love to like make some like GitHub action that commits that to the repo so someone new to the project can just see like this is the intended workflow of what's happening in this file. Like, bam, here's a quick overview.
And that's,
I like
you
that
bring
idea.
up another good point, is like the more dedicated tooling you can set up around infrastructure around docs, the better, right? So like OpenAI or Open API specs or type generation, or, you know, like the more and more you can ease that DX, but in a way that also generates things that are more human readable and comprehensible, the better off you're going to be, not just for your newcomers, but for your existing team that's working on the code base as well.
Yeah, I've worked on some projects where like the Open API spec just didn't get updated when the code got updated. And it's like, well, yeah, I'm looking at the Open API spec and that's not on the payload. And they're like, oh, yeah, I forgot to update that. Whoops.
Right.
And it's like,
and I think,
yeah, like
and I
I
think
love
that says
tools that
something
help
about
automate testing that.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, Dread.js is one I'm familiar with. Is there one that you know?
Well, I was thinking more like network requests, right? Like I know that a lot of people don't like GraphQL. I love it. I love GraphQL because it has a bit of that self-documenting behavior, and it's really hard to get code out of sync where it's like, I didn't document that thing. Oh no. And it's like, well, if you didn't document it, it literally didn't ship, right?
Sure.
Like, so I haven't heard of, did you say Drake.js?
Dread, as in like Judge Dredd.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he is the API law. So basically, he'll take your Open API spec and turn it into integration tests and make actual like requests against your API.
Oh,
So
I
if
love
it
that.
comes back with fields, like you can make it be strict and it comes back with fields that weren't defined, boom, that's an error. Right?
Nice.
So if you have that in your like entire CI/CD process on the API side, then bam, your front end devs are never complaining about an out of date Open API spec. Like it's really
That's
cool.
incredible.
Yeah. Now it is a bit out of date. I was hoping there's something like new I could use because it still says its OpenAPI 3 support is experimental. And OpenAPI 3 is not experimental anymore.
Right. You know,
So
I'd be
that's
really
fine.
interested to see if there was an integration with that and MSW on the front end, so that you could like auto mock all of your endpoints without having to write out the mock files individually. That'd be interesting.
Yeah, that's smart. Like really, as long as Dread is making sure that your OpenAPI spec is up to date, anything that can digest your OpenAPI spec into mock service worker stuff would be really nice too.
Right.
Right? But like, I don't know if you necessarily need to like combine those.
Nah. Yeah.
Cool. And yeah, I think I was looking at your resume. You did some like documentation stuff for like Clerk. Like that's cool. What was that?
Yeah.
Like?
So we're talking a little bit about my freelance stuff here. I've done documentation for Clerk, Replay.io, Astro. I'm trying to think. I'm sure there's other smaller documentation projects that I've done here and there. And of course, all my open source stuff. I just wrote the docs for TanStack Start, which is like a new meta framework that's like looking to compete with Next.js. So I love docs. Docs are like my bread and butter. So it's no wonder that I'm like, yeah, write the docs, just do it.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. I have like a fun building process thing I'm doing for one of my side projects where I'm really proud of the docs, and that's always a good feeling.
Yeah. There's nothing like finishing up a project and just like polishing it with docs and just like, mwah, it's beautiful. It's like a little bow tie on top.
Exactly. Tell me about TanStack a bit, like TanStack Start.
Sure. So it was really interesting. I started a project. Let me actually back up a little bit. My last company, I was the team lead for the front end, like I had mentioned. And we were looking to do this really, really complex set of forms in our applications, like all of them. And I was like, okay, well, we should really sit down and standardize on a tool, figure out what we want to do. You know, like I don't know what the state of forms is today. I've been out of the form game for a little while. And especially because I'd been doing Angular for a bit, so I was back in the React world. So I was like, all right, I'm going to assign one of my team members to just go research and do an RFC, right? Mm-hmm. And he came back and he was like, oh, well, you know, this exists, this exists. And I kind of don't like any of them. And I came to the conclusion that I was like, yeah, I'm not a huge fan of these as well, right? Like some of them are better than others, but none of them fit our exact needs. So in about a week, I rapidly prototyped a library called Houseform. Okay. And Houseform was just like an API that I really liked that I just like randomly threw at the wall, right?
Okay.
And I came back and I was like, what about this? And they were like, oh, we love it. It's great, you know? Mm-hmm. And I remember at the exact week that I was announcing Houseform V1 publicly, Tanner announced TanStack Form. And I was like, oh, great. It's over. GG's. And one of the APIs he had was just like so elegant. The idea that you could like get a component from a hook and like have type safety there was awesome. So I reached out to Tanner. I'm like, hey man, I think we're going to the same event here soon. Like, what if we just sync up and chat about stuff, right?
Yeah.
And we had a 30-minute conversation that at the very beginning. I was like, I want to change all your APIs. They all suck, and here's why. And he was like, I don't know, man. I don't think that's I don't think so. And at the end of the conversation, he was like, dude, okay, you might have something here. Like, we're cooking.
That's awesome.
And it's crazy that, like, I think that this, like, going back to team, like, work for a second, that receptiveness, even with hesitancy of a new idea, is just such a gangster move on Tanner's part.
Yeah.
Like, to take a project that he was, like, actively working on and just completely detour it based on feedback early on is awesome, right?
Yeah.
Like, the ability to do that is I think, really emblematic of Tanner's and other people's ability to be in a team and to be conducive to that environment, right?
Right. They might have like a goal or whatever, like, but at the end of the day, like getting the thing shipped and working and really nice to use is more important than like some of the short-term goals he might have had of just like, this is something I wanted to build. Like,
right,
so, yeah.
Exactly. So from there, joined as TanStack Form maintainer, and we've built store and config, which are projects that I've kind of taken stewardship over. And then I've contributed small bits here and there to Start and whatever else.
Sure. So, yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. Definitely like back to the team stuff. I loved how you like said you had like someone do an RFC, right? Like, like a research spike. Like I love the idea of a research spike because there's so much in like planning that is undefined. Like there's the known unknowns and then there's unknown unknowns. You use the research spike to figure out some of those unknown unknowns to make them known, right?
Right.
Like, I love
And I think that that's how Agile is supposed to work, at least to my knowledge, right? Like, I'm not a PM. I'm not super knowledgeable on it, but I know enough that, like, when we were at Hilton, we had a really strong Agile process. Like, not just like, we do Agile, you know?
Right.
But it was really impressive because, like, we had a pre-refinement, right? Which was, like, you sit down, you ask the questions that you do not know the answers to. And then the PM would go spike that either into its own research or just go ask the questions or have the answers for you.
Yep.
We'd have our refinement like a week or two after that of the pre-refinement that we had done 2 weeks prior. where we would actually delegate out the tickets and assign them sprint or sizes and stuff like that. And then we would like go do it. And like we had like a dedicated allocated amount that we knew that we could like work within reason for. Like it was a well-tuned ship.
Yeah. And you have like a better idea of estimating, like after doing a little bit of research. Like it took me 4 hours to learn about this stuff. It's going to take me more than 4 to like, build it, you know? Like,
exactly. So I think that too many teams that try to do Agile are missing that key component of research. It's super important to be able and to be allowed to say, I do not know the answer to that question in sprint planning.
Yep. Yeah, there's a meme on my stream where it's like, oh yeah, like we're an Agile shop. Hey Tim, come over here. Guy runs over, does a backflip, runs away. Like, yeah, see how Agile we are?
Yeah, we're super Agile. We're loose, we're with it.
Yeah, like just, you know, like them completely misunderstanding the term. Like that's the fun of it, I think. Like, that's great, the joke, you know. But yeah, like that's actually like such a common thing. Like, well, we did the sticky notes on the wall. Doesn't that make us Agile?
Right. So, we're using Jira. Come on, guys.
That's it. That's all you needed to do. Yeah, that's funny. Okay. So now that you are kind of like, you know, like, I guess you're still like an independent contributor as a staff engineer, but you still have to do like team stuff. Like you still have to like maybe embed with other teams, like from time to time. Like, how do you go about learning about what they're doing, right? Like, you know, to try and like work from that higher level of like cross-team communication.
So one of the things that I'll start with something that I don't like and then move to something that I do like, right?
Sure.
Something that I don't like is when companies really try to silo their developers, right? Like, oh, you have a Slack channel, but it's a private channel. You have to be invited, you know, like, or even docs like that are siloed off where it's like, okay, well, how do I figure out how backend deploys? Because I think that there might be a bug in the node version running an old SSL certificate that impacts the headers and blah, blah, you know what I mean? Like, you may be able to figure stuff out like that out as a front-end developer, even if that's not necessarily your purview, right? Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of value in just keeping the doors open, like door open, come on in style. But then on top of that, something that I really liked is this idea of like knowledge sharing time, like dedicated, like show and tell is what we do at Descript, right?
Okay.
So like, do you have something interesting to show? Let's do it. And this is on top of, you know, usual stand-ups and whatever else. But it gives time for people to really be like, look, here's this thing that I've been working on. Here's why it's cool. Here's why you want to use it. Here's why you don't want to use it. You know, like almost like that research phase condensed into a meeting and then like presented as like something that someone's eager to share is I think a really powerful communication mechanism.
And yeah, it's like on the fly, so there's going to be stuff that might not be in the docs, right? Like, you know, because they're just like, oh yeah, and then you got to click this because that one weird bug or something, right? And like, no one's going to document that weird bug because it's going to get fixed eventually, right?
Right.
Yeah, totally.
There's nothing more permanent than a temporary fix, though.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So I guess, what do you try to do to make like onboarding a new dev easier? Right? Like, in my opinion, like, yes, docs, but like, how? Like, how do you do that documentation for devs? Right? Specifically, like developer environment stuff, like, you know, onboarding.
So one of the things that I try to do is I try to make sure that any tool that is so the way that I see it is that there's like tiered lists almost, right? Like there's the S tier tools, there's the B tier tools, and I don't mean that like literally like a tier list, but instead I mean it more like these are the tools that we are mandated to use. We have to use Docker, we have to use Yarn, we have to use whatever, right?
Sure.
And then at my last company, we got really good at consolidating on one Git GUI, right? And just being able to share that Git GUI and understand that like, hey, here's how you use this interface and how you communicate with each other, and I'll send you a screenshot of what mine looks like, and you know, whatever.
Yep.
And then there's the lower rung of like, yeah, people use it, right? Like VS Code. I don't use VS Code traditionally. I use WebStorm. Sure. I was the only person on my team at the last company that used WebStorm. Right. So even then I acknowledged, okay, if I'm going to onboard somebody new, I'm probably going to use VS Code. We're probably going to do some live share, you know, like using that extension to be able to walk through code, which is really why everyone used it. It was such a beneficial tool for teamwork.
Interesting.
Yeah, that was a really interesting company because we would use Discord for our main communication, and we would just sit in the voice channels like all day. And that was how we like jumped in and out of each other's virtual office.
Right.
It was a really neat experience.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, I think that having those tools documented in kind of that forefronted matter of like, here's this, but also leverage the fact that you're not documenting everything properly.
Sure.
Right? Like great example. I know at one of my companies, I think it was Hilton, we treated Ken C. Dodd's work like it was gospel, right?
Yep.
But how would you know that if you weren't already there?
Sure.
Right? So why not provide a recommended reading section? Why not have a regular rotation of a book club?
That's
not,
good.
you know what I mean? Like
that.
leverage the fact that you're not Ken C. Dodd, so you're not going to end up writing hundreds of thousands of words or whatever. Or even maybe do start doing that. Assign tickets out to build out your blog. Use it as an engineering hiring tool, you know?
Yeah, when I've brought new people on, my favorite thing is to have them try and set up the project just using the README. And if there's anything missing, boom, their first contribution can be filling in that blank, right? So it's like they can be first commit that first day if they find something that someone forgot to put in there about like, oh yeah, when you run Docker on, a Mac, you got to do this other command versus Linux or something, right? Like, sure. Yeah, just because your whole team is on Mac and one person's on Linux, that one person on Linux can fill in some blanks, if they're like new to the team or whatever.
And I think that you just touched on something really critical there that I want to highlight for anyone listening.
Yeah.
If you are new to a team, do not hesitate to make your first pull request as soon as you think is reasonable. I remember when I joined Hilton, I was like, oh, I've worked at like 3-person startups. I don't know what I'm doing. Like, of course Hilton must know. Like, I opened my IDE and just flood of errors, just a flood of them, just hundreds. And I was like, oh, I must have my environment set up wrong. I don't want to ask. I'm going to get fired. Like I was freaking out about it, right?
Right.
Like as a new, like.
They're going to find me out, right?
Yeah.
Imposter syndrome at 1,000%.
And I remember I had fixed the tool with like one TypeScript flag, right? Just like flipping a true to false or false, whatever, right?
Yeah.
And I remember I didn't commit it for months. And finally I was like, hey guys, I think I have a fix. And they're like, oh, he fixed the thing that's been broken for forever.
Right? But you could have done that like day one.
Day one and looked like a total god, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So you're thinking you're going to be found out, but instead, like, you're going to be found out in a good way. Like,
right.
Instead, just commit code. Like, we're all human.
And ask questions. I think so often newcomers don't feel comfortable asking questions. So I think going back to the interpersonal stuff, like, it is so important that you have an environment where developers feel comfortable and safe asking questions, acknowledging that they don't know things. In fact, I remember one time we had an incident where someone had accidentally leaked a key. They had just made like a total boneheaded move and like uploaded the key to a service to try to do something. And they were like, oh no, wait, hang on. Like they had like that post clarity, like that like post upload clarity. And they're like, oh, I made a horrible mistake. We got to go rotate our keys now. And I remember like, no one on admin was really asking who it was, but even then I still wouldn't mention who it was because there's some like the minute you go tell someone, hey, this is the person that made the mistake and point an individual finger is the minute that suddenly they stop talking to you. They stop giving you that feedback that you need to hear and telling you when they've made a mistake, right?
Right.
So I think that one of the things that I really like doing as an engineering lead is helping distribute blame, right? Whether that's code reviews, like at my last company, I made it such that if you signed off on a code review, you were partially to blame if something was broken as part of that commit.
Sure.
Right? So like just making sure that there's no individual person who feels like, oh man, I totally screwed it, because you're part of a team. Right? Like that's the important part, is making sure that you're able to communicate with each other, build tooling together, and if there's an incident, you handle it as a team, not just, throwing stuff at one person.
Yeah, it's almost you just got to have that like open culture, like, because any problem that happens like that, like a key getting committed, is pretty much an organizational failure, right? There should have been some checks and balances or something. And like, rather than point a finger, you can learn how to fix it into the future so it doesn't happen again. And that's so much more beneficial than finding a scapegoat, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it'll solve problems in the long term too, right? Like finding a scapegoat is awesome because now you get to blame someone in the short term.
Yeah.
But then what happens when it happens a second time, a third time? What happens when it becomes a regular occurrence and you start ignoring the problem and now you're not rotating your keys when they're getting committed because it's just part of the culture now.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. Slightly different question. Like, how many repos do you tend to work on at a time? Like, or like within a team, what was like the most amount of repos you've had?
Oh man, I think it's probably Tanstack, to be honest.
Okay.
Tanstack has a lot of moving parts, either that or the Redux stuff that I've been working on recently. I'll open up my WebStorm and you can attach multiple folders from different locations to reference different files and whatever. And I'll have like 6 to 8 repos open at the same time. Wow. And that's a lot to juggle.
That is. Yeah. And is that like common to the rest of the people working on that Redux stuff? Or is that...
which is interesting. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. But like they didn't want to mono repo it, or like it didn't start as mono repos and migrating to it might not be worth it, right?
Right. And it's interesting because I think in open source it's a lot harder to go from poly repo to mono repo, simply because there's stuff like issues, and then you have your stars, and you have your tracking, your usage, and
you don't want to lose those stars. Like those took a lot of effort to get.
Yeah, yeah. Like I know it's like kind of a meme, but like also legitimately, like no, that's and there's something to be said about like being able to track which repos are being starred for which reasons is actually a very valuable insight if you're able to leverage it. Like, how are people using these different tools, and how are they cross communicating? How are they using them in isolation and stuff?
Sure.
But in organizations, I've tended to move towards monorepo like as quickly as I humanly can, because I think it's a little bit better.
Yeah. I worked on a team where they were the back end, I was the front end, so I didn't have to deal with it. But they had like 60 repos or something, like because they were doing AWS Lambda, and they had a repo per Lambda.
Wow,
which was brutal. And they would also then like they had a common library for like common like utility things. When they needed to update that library, they would have Saturday merge parties. It was terrible. They would come in on a Saturday. All right, guys, let's get these pushed up to dev, to staging, to prod, all 60 of them.
And here's your pizza.
Yeah, like it was remote, so like they didn't even have that. They was like, here's a DoorDash gift card or something.
Yeah, go figure. Oh, jeez.
Yeah, so that was fun. I showed up to one, and I was like, do you guys actually need me? And they're like, nah. Because I was on the front end, like, it was just the front end repo, you know? It was great.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that was funny. Okay. And, like, what is how do you document, like, when you have 6 repos you got to open up? How do you know? Like, if you're new to that project, like, how do you know which ones you should pull down? Like, is there, like, a place to document that, really?
Yeah.
Like the README, I guess, yeah.
So it depends on which Git provider you're using, but there's a way that you can pin repositories to the top of, like, your list. One of my favorite things to do is to have nothing else pinned except for a dev contributors guide, right?
Oh,
Here's the de facto existence of this like documentation, and then here's a bunch of README files and images or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. But then you can sit there and you can track these are your 6 repos. Here's how they're all shared. Here's how, whatever else, and use it as like a README buffer multiple projects at once.
Sure, I like that. Now, do you find that it's hard to keep that in sync with the other projects then, because it kind of lives on its own?
Yes and no. I think the yes part is because you can easily add a repository and suddenly the like shared documentation is a little out of whack, right?
Sure.
But generally, I don't tend to commit things to that that shared repository unless if it is something that is truly shared amongst all of the things, right?
Right.
So, like, you're not going to go change your code structure overnight. And if you are, please document it. Like,
right, yeah.
These are important things that you need to be updating. So I don't think it's too bad once you get in the habit of updating your documentation on a regular basis.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I do notice we're getting close to that half-hour time. That went quick. Like, this is a fun chat. Yeah, this is great. Is there anything you want to, like, plug? Like maybe your unicorn utterances stuff or any of that?
Sure. It's actually renamed since then.
Okay.
We're now
My
Playful
bad.
Programming. Hey.
Playful programming. That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Sure. So I'll plug my book. I wrote a book that teaches React, Angular, and Vue all at the same time. It's a little more dry than this conversation has been because it focuses more on the technical aspects, but I try to keep it a little lighthearted and fun occasionally.
Yep.
So it's called the Framework Field Guide. I'm updating it soon for Angular Signals, but other than that, it's got all the modern goodness. It's got all the hooks and the setup API and Vue and whatnot, and it's getting long. The first book was like 500 pages when printed, and the second book is already like 30,000 words, and I've only started it. It's going to be a really long book trilogy when I'm done.
Okay.
But yeah, go check it out. Let me know what you think.
You're going to be the George R.R. Martin of coding docs.
My girlfriend keeps making that joke, and I like it's a meme that I really appreciate.
There you go.
It's funny. Like one of the things that I'll highlight on the website is like if you go to the website, there's a mention that it's free, right? And there's a big button that's like why it's free. And if you click on it, there's a little bit of story that you might relate to. Like if you're listening to this podcast, you're obviously interested in to some degree in empathy and understanding the human nature of coding. And I just wrote like a bit of a personal letter to the tech community about like my journey from going from like not being able to afford food and having psychiatric issues to being able to make it in tech and wanting to give back to the community. So, check out the letter. Let me know what you think.
That sounds great. I'll definitely check that out because, I'm pretty sure you know this about me. I used to be a snowboard bum. I lived in a van. It was up by the Salmon River side of the parking lot.
Right.
Right. I got a food box, from like the community centers and stuff. Like, yeah, totally. I was broke. But it was the best time of my life, the snowboarding stuff. I totally relate to that. Like getting into tech is, it's not easy, but I do think anyone can do it with enough effort.
Oh, big time.
And I love that. Like, it's like, so it's not easy, it's accessible, which I think is really cool.
I like that.
Yeah. But yeah, so we are coming up on time. Thank you so much for joining me, Corbin, and everyone out there on the podcast. Thank you very much for joining and listening, and I hope you enjoyed this. And we've got 4 or 5 more of these coming, I think. So, cheers.
Cheers.